critique of the British government's decision to take Britain to war in 2003 than was perhaps anticipated.
We have concluded that the UK chose to join the invasion of Iraq before the peaceful options for disarmament had been exhausted. Military action at that time was not a last resort. We have also concluded that the judgments about the severity of the threat posed by Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, WMD, were presented with a certainty that was not justified.
It's a report that's been years in the making at a cost of some £10 million to the British taxpayers. And while Sir John Chilcot has said he will not shy away from attributing blame, whether that be to those who are in corporations and organizations and individuals, the demonstrators gathered behind me are hoping he will send that message in the strongest possible terms to name, shame, and blame. It is the role of former Prime Minister Tony Blair that comes in for the most vocal criticism.
This wasn't the only option on the table. There were peaceful diplomatic channels that hadn't been exhausted beforehand. That's very, very important. And there seems to me to be enough evidence to show that actually lies were told to the public.
Today is our last chance to have any effect on having him arrested for what we all know, what probably 80% of this country knows, which of course is that Tony Blair committed those war crimes along with Bush, which have started ISIS and have killed at least over 1 million Iraqis.
The report, running to some 2.3 million words, drew specific conclusions. Amongst them, despite explicit warnings, the consequences of the invasion were underestimated. The planning and preparation for Iraq after Saddam Hussein were wholly inadequate. Mr. Blair overestimated his ability to influence US decisions on Iraq. And UK forces in Iraq face gaps in some key capability areas, including armored vehicles, reconnaissance and intelligence assets, and helicopter support. For the families of those hundreds of thousands of Iraqis killed or displaced in the country, and the loved ones of the 176 service personnel killed, it was a particularly sobering moment.
We call on the British government immediately to follow up Sir John's findings, to ensure that the political process by which our country decides to go to war is never again twisted and confused, with no liability for such actions.
David Cameron addressed the British Parliament and insisted lessons must be learned from the mistakes outlined in Chilcot's report. Amina Taylor, Press TV, London.
Well, I guess joining us for this edition of the debate, we have peace activist, author, and political analyst David Swanson, who joins us from Charlottesville. And we have author and broadcaster Jonathan Fryer, who joins us from London. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both. Jonathan Fryer, let me first start with you. Well, you've, I'm sure, have anticipated this report amongst with many others. 7 years it took, and finally it's out. What is your reaction?
Well, I agree with the statement in your earlier report that actually it's quite stronger than many of us were expecting, and that actually is good news. It took a very long time to do because Sir John Chilcot called several witnesses several times over, and others delayed for months being heard. And then, of course, there's this immense report itself, as you said, 2.5 million words almost, which is about the equivalent of 30 normal-sized books. So it's a massive document, but there are some real indictments and a lot for Tony Blair to answer for, as well as for future British governments to take note.
Well, David Swanson, one of the things that this report did not do was to implicate Tony Blair or present the facts so that it would lead up to him to have committed a war crime, obviously. And that this war was illegal, because then it would implicate him. Do you think that was one of the purposes behind this report?
Well, first of all, it does a lot more than anything that's been done in the United States, and we here are looking to it as a precedent for beginning to hold people accountable here. But launching a war and being a significant accomplice to a war is the supreme crime in the world, regardless of what lies are told, what advice you were given, what cabinet meetings discussed. It's a crime. We didn't need any report to know that. But this report, you know, which is longer than the Bible, is a bit like the Bible. You can can pick out good bits and bad bits and things that go in the direction you're looking for. But it makes crystal clear that Blair was advised by his Attorney General and others repeatedly that this would be illegal, and that gentleman was brought to more or less fudging and reversing his position without good basis just days before the U.S. attack on Baghdad. It makes crystal clear that the Joint Intelligence Committee had advised Blair that this would be counterproductive, that this would increase terrorism, endanger the United Kingdom and the United States, not protect them, that if there really were any weapons, the way to get them to be used or passed along to terrorists would be precisely to attack Iraq. This is a report that, if you look at the good bits of it, all of which were already known and in the public realm, is quite damning of Tony Blair, and there indeed ought to be an impeachment, as Alex Salmond and others have been urging in the Parliament, but there also ought to be a tribunal established and prosecutions begun. There is no greater crime than what was done here.
Jonathan Fryer, I don't know if you caught Tony Blair, his reaction to this report being published and for it to be out. He spoke at length. I think it was a couple hours that he spoke. He started out okay, but then, I don't know, he frayed somewhere in there. And the reason why I say he frayed is because, there's a lot of, and I have to mention this, because there's a lot of British families who lost their loved ones in this war, aside from obviously the Iraqis who lost so many lives. But they are still holding him responsible. They don't even have, without a shadow of doubt, any doubt in their minds that Tony Blair should be prosecuted for war crimes. Should Tony Blair be prosecuted for war crimes?
I think certainly that the relevant international lawyers need to look and see whether there is indeed a case that can be brought against him. I think it's important to remember that at the time, in 2003, the third party in Britain, the Liberal Democrats, argued strongly against the war. There was a march of about 1 million people against the war. And interestingly, the current leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, was against the war, and indeed in Parliament today suggested that indeed perhaps there should be a move at the ICC to bring charges against Tony Blair. Listening to Tony Blair at his 2-hour press conference, it was interesting to see he apologised, he regretted what had happened, but he didn't accept that he had lied. He didn't accept that the people had died in vain. And I know for the families of those nearly 180 servicemen and women who did die in Iraq, it's a very hard pill to try and swallow with that, because they believe that basically the decision had been taken to go to war very soon after 9/11 in 2001, and that basically he was just waiting for an opportunity to jump in with George W. Bush on a war on very shaky basis.
Well, David Swanson, because so many years have passed, perhaps politicians, officials may think that the general public has forgotten. But let's take a look at one of the things that Chilcot said. He said the circumstances in which it was decided that there was a legal basis for UK military action were far from satisfactory. I'm not too sure how he can use that word satisfactory without making it sound, without a shadow of doubt, in a sense, that this war was illegal. I mean, it's either legal or illegal, but it's not interpreted that way. Is that written and delivered that way on purpose by Chilcot?
Well, one has to assume after this many years of drafting that everything is on purpose and well thought out. This war was, of course, illegal. All wars are illegal. Under the Kellogg-Briand Pact, under which the Nazis and the Japanese were prosecuted, war is illegal. And under the UN Charter, with very narrow exceptions, not met here. After months of effort discussed at length in this report of trying to meet those exceptions, of trying to gain UN authorization, there was a failure to do so, and there was the decision to proceed as described in the report on the Kosovo method, referring back to the war on Kosovo, that is to just ignore the United Nations and go around it and act illegally anyway, which is what was done. And here you have a report clearly written with every effort made to bend over backwards to sympathize with the criminals. That is, to see things from their point of view, to claim that this war is uniquely aggressive. Every other war is clearly radically different and defensive and in response to an attack. I don't know where they get that, ignoring Afghanistan and Libya and all the other wars, but the intention being to set no precedent. And then treating the beliefs and the level of passion behind the supposed beliefs of people like Tony Blair as having a sort of importance that they're never treated as with any other criminal. So that, on the one hand, we have what the government was advised, what the intelligence showed, what the facts point to, what's in the written law, and on the other hand, we have their beliefs. And the report actually claims that UK officials never even considered, literally never even considered, that there might be no weapons of mass destruction. Now, how you can run around asserting that there are weapons of mass destruction, contrary to everything you've been told, without so much as considering that there might not be, which seems to be built into the assertion, is ludicrous. But this is a report that strains to, contorts language to avoid using the word lied. It goes to every effort, and yet still is being rightly seen as a huge condemnation of Tony Blair and his cabinet.
Okay, let's take a quick time out. Listen to some of the viewer comments on this. We had quite a few, and then we'll get back to the debate.
We know this and the real reason why they went in, but who is going to be accountable for the mass murder and crimes against humanity? It seems Bush and Blair are the two who were chosen by Satan to put all this in motion. I'm very sure the British only revealed 5% of the total inquiry of what actually led them to Iraq. A day to remember Dr. David Kelly, Chief Weapons Inspector, who challenged Blair and the 6th 45-minute dossier and was then found stuffed full of tranquilizers, hanging in a tree with his wrist slit. Blair and his company are rich after the war, but Iraqis become poor as they lost everything. Flawed intelligence? I think not. It was an outright lie on the part of the US and the Brits, manufactured on purpose in order to justify their theft of resources in Iraq and their effort to keep their hooves planted in the Persian Gulf region.
Well, those were just some of the viewer comments there. Jonathan Fryer, it's very surreal. It's almost unbelievable if you think about when this report was released, which is today. And if you think about the fact that just 2 days ago, Iraq experienced one of the worst bombing attacks since the 2003 invasion. If these two were to coincide on the same day, it almost makes this unbelievable. But yet Tony Blair says that I still stand firm on the fact that I was right in removing, along with his allies, Saddam Hussein. He doesn't realize that that should be done by the people of that nation. And yet we have this blast, 250 people to have been killed. Why doesn't Tony Blair see that?
Well, he seems to be in a state of complete denial. I suppose it's the only way he's able to sleep at night, by convincing himself that he didn't lie and that he was doing something that he believed was right. Now he's claiming it was on the basis of faulty intelligence, but the report itself does very clearly condemn the fact that no proper preparations were put in place for what would happen after the war, after the invasion, let alone any justification for the invasion. And that is really damning. For example, the Americans had decided that they were going to disband the Iraqi army when they took over, which was an absolutely mad decision. I mean, even at the end of the Second World War, when Germany was occupied, it was recognized that we had to work with various institutions that existed in order to stop chaos. And that's exactly what happened in Iraq. The army was disbanded, people were sent home, often with their weapons, but with no wages anymore, and one thing led to another. But as I say, Tony Blair just seems to be in a state of denial. But he is a man who can't go out in the street in Britain without being shouted at by ordinary people.
Well, David Swanson, it's interesting that you said in the beginning of the program that something like this would be great to see it in the U.S. And I'm wondering, when Blair says that one of the pillars of UK's foreign policy shouldn't be changed, and that is to align our foreign policy, the UK's foreign policy with the US, that doesn't sound like the UK has learned a lesson from what has happened.
It does not, and Tony Blair is out taking responsibility because he knows darn well that he's not about to be treated as a criminal, and the lesson is not about to be learned. Perhaps the European Union should learn the lesson that it's better off without the UK in it as a puppet for the United States. But I think to your point you just made, it's very interesting that this week one of the Iraqis who helped topple the statue of Saddam Hussein on the glorious day of the U.S. takeover of Baghdad said this week, like majority opinion in Iraq, he would prefer to go back to the Saddam Hussein government, a government that killed many of his family members, than to continue with the disaster that the invasion created. So majority opinion in Iraq is against Tony Blair's view. And of course, in the Chilcot report, you see the cabinet discussions of the fact that they know, and they're telling the U.S. that what they're trying to do is against the will of the British public back then. So you have a report that in the end recommends, you know, involving a few more committees and so forth, but never says we should have had a public referendum, which would have solved the problem in Britain then or now. You know, the public, it's greatly to their credit that Tony Blair can't go outside, and it's largely the same for Bush and Cheney and others here in the United States, I'm happy to say.
Well, that's one of the things we haven't talked about, Jonathan Fryer, and that is the fact that how much of this war, with Tony Blair making the decision that he said that he pretty much ended up doing because he was somewhat led through this path or on this path by the U.S. Do you think the U.S. played a major influence on having Tony Blair decide that it would join it?
Definitely, and we mustn't underestimate the importance of the personal relationship between George W. Bush and Tony Blair. Tony Blair at times seemed like a sort of eager dog following George Bush, keen to do whatever his master wanted, and it infuriated many people in Britain, including myself at the time, because it was clear that he was basically wanting to keep Britain as the Americans' strongest ally, despite the fact that this caused a lot of ruction with our EU partners. Germany in particular, for example, was deeply unhappy about the way that the United Nations Security Council was being essentially outmaneuvered, and that time was not being given to really examine the evidence. And I spoke to Hans Blix, the UN weapons inspector at that time, and he was appalled that Tony Blair was going to go ahead with this. He couldn't say publicly at the time, but obviously since he stood down from his job, I can now say that he did say that. And in Britain, the public still is very, very angry. It may be 13 years ago, but we still feel that anger very strongly. We did not do it in our name.
Okay. Well, David Swanson, 2003, fast forward, and we're looking at 2016. We're looking at a region that is engulfed in what is known as this phenomenon by the name of Daesh. And looking at many facts behind this group, obviously it points to Iraq, it points to the destabilization and occupation that emanated from that 2003 war, in some sense. Is it right to say that Tony Blair and George Bush were responsible for destabilizing Iraq and the spread of terrorism in the region?
Well, certainly it's right to say, well, there are many other parties to be blamed as well, but these are the chief culprits in initiating this slide toward disaster. And what's important in this report and others is that it was predicted by their own experts before they did it. They knew that this was the expectation, that they would be making things worse, that overthrowing a government would lead to this sort of disaster, and they went ahead with it anyway. And through the course of this global war on terror that has yet to end, this has been the prediction, and this has been the analysis in the United States of numerous top military officials the day after they retire, is that continuing down this path is counterproductive, that you're making it worse, that you're generating more enemies than you're killing. And for all the suffering of the U.S. and British troops and their families, it's a drop in the bucket in comparison with what was done to Iraq, perhaps 5% of the nation killed outright. Millions of people made refugees. The society, the infrastructure, the poisoning of the soil and the water, the health epidemics, a country that will never recover. And what's also made clear in this report is that Britain might have stopped it. That France was pushing back, Chile was pushing back, Germany, Russia, China, that if the United Kingdom had said no and opposed this along with the rest of the world, there's a possibility that it would have stopped it. So that's more than an accomplice. That's really a key player in the worst crime of the past 40 years.
We're quickly running out of time. Jonathan Fryer, if you can tell me in about 30 seconds, we're still looking at wars. We're looking at the war in Yemen. We're looking at the war in Syria. We're still looking at the UK involved in these wars one way or another. Don't they understand? Hasn't it been obviously a learning thing for them from what happened in Iraq? Because these countries are brewing these terrorists. They're attracting terrorists. Yemen is supposed to have the AQAP, supposed to be the biggest threat to U.S.'s security. And of course, it translates into Europe, and UK could be part of that. So why are they continuing with this involvement in wars?
Well, certainly the current Conservative government seems to be completely believing that this is the best way forward, despite criticisms from opposition parties such as part of the Labour Party, the Scottish Nationalists, the Liberal Democrats, because I think most liberal-minded people in Britain recognise that actually it's through negotiation and through constructive engagement that we solve problems, not by having more wars.
Okay, and if I can give David Swanson 30 seconds, please. Same question.
I missed the question, but I think that what we hope would come out of this would be very different from the recommendations of the report, which are go ahead and have more wars, but be a little more public, get a little more public support. Don't promise outcomes because you don't know what will happen. Don't lie quite so much. No, that is not what should come out of this. What should come out of this is no more wars. This is the supreme crime as it was described at Nuremberg and should be described at a tribunal for the criminals behind this one. No more of it.
Thank you. Peace activist, author and political analyst David Swanson there. Author and broadcaster Jonathan Fryer, previous to him, spoke to us from London. Thanks so much for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From Mika Vatawa and the entire team in the capital, Tehran, it's goodbye.